Hello, dear colleagues and friends. I would like to share with you the main findings of my research paper presented at the MPSA 81st Annual Conference held in Chicago, United States of America on April 4-7, 2024. So let's start. The research explores the issue of democratic and autocratic diffusions in post-Soviet space, especially by taking into consideration the situation emerged since Russia's war in Ukraine, as well as the destabilizing effect and new challenges to peace building engendered by Azerbaijan in the South Caucasus. Recent developments in post-Soviet space clearly showcase that authoritarian rulers are consistently challenging democratic ones by violating the territorial integrity and sovereignty of their states. In this regard, Russia challenges the Eastern Europe and Azerbaijan, backed by Russia in its turn, challenges the South Caucasus. By their aggressive intentions and active policies, the post-Soviet autocratic countries surely want to create a vulnerable and disadvantageous image of democracy. They promote a fake idea that democracy is incompatible with security, because they realize that sustainable democratization in post-Soviet space will entirely destroy the political and economic impact of autocratic countries on their neighbors by engendering preconditions for fostering their independence and sovereignty. So let's begin from the main question. Why Russia fears democracy? Countries in every region of the world have been captured by authoritarian rulers in recent years. For much of the 21st century, however, democracy's opponents have labored persistently to dismantle this international order. The fruits of their exertions are now apparent. Russia and other autocracies have succeeded in shifting geopolitical incentives, jeopardizing the consensus that democracy is the only viable path to prosperity and security, while encouraging more authoritarian approaches to governance. Under Putin's rule, Russia's policy is considerably hardened both domestically and internationally. It has gone from a mixture of oligarchy and democracy to a regime of autocracy, and from an effort to imitate and join the West to verbal aggressiveness towards the United States and an effort to reassert Russia's domination over its former empire, especially in post-Soviet space. An important link between the two evolutions is to be found in the post-imperial nostalgia of the Russian population, in the new imperial ambition of its leaders, and in their fear of the spread of color revolutions among their neighbors. Why Russia is so sensitive about color revolutions? Because these revolutions lead to democratic regimes development, which is the biggest fear of autocratic countries. So, the post-Soviet transformation has showcased the formation of two groups of countries, autocratic and democratic ones. Obviously, autocratic countries in Russia's near abroad are more or less safe and not threatened by Russia in comparison with democratic ones. In the last 2 decades, Russia is concentrated on its aggressive policies regarding its neighboring countries that have chosen the democratic way of state building and social development. Since the 90s, Russia was also aggressive to its internal democratic movements. If we take into consideration the fact that the post-Soviet space is fractured between autocracies and democracies, we can clearly see and confirm that post-Soviet countries with democratic trends in Russia's near abroad, such as Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, and Armenia, are really endangered and targeted by Russia. In these countries and around them, Russia has created conflict zones to use political leverages of control by managing these conflicts. On the contrary, Russia is now strengthening its ties with post-Soviet autocratic countries such as Belarus and Azerbaijan by forging with them more common interests. Even in the case of post-Soviet conflict settlement, Russia acts according to the interest of autocratic countries by neglecting the interest of democratic ones. For example, the resolution of Nagorno-Karabakh conflict was accomplished only with the respect of Azerbaijani interests when not only the bloody war against Armenians in 2020 was recognized by Russia as legitimate, but also the whole territory of this region was recognized as inseparable part of Azeri state without the rights of Armenians to autonomy. Being the only warrantor of the Armenian population's security and their rights in Nagorno-Karabakh, Russia does nothing to protect them during ethnic cleansing in the last year. Taking into consideration the democratic trends in neighboring countries, Russia, when necessary, even does not recognize the fundamental documents that it has signed when these documents in current situation don't reflect its national interests. For example, 1991 Almaty Declaration, according to which all administrative borders of the Soviet Union member states have become state borders for post-Soviet countries. Russia even does not support democratic trends not only in its near abroad but also on its own territory. All democratic leaders of the Russian political opposition were killed or passed away during the last 2 decades. For example, the last two political deaths of Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny. These deaths also demonstrate that Russia's ruling political elite is not intended to real political pluralism, democracy, or to free and open political competition. The democracies in post-Soviet space is only supported and promoted by the West, especially by US and EU. That's why Russia considers them as a real threat and geopolitical challenge. In this respect, in his address to the Congress, the US president highlighted the importance of defending democracy around the world. Biden began by emphasizing what he said are threats facing democracy around the world and calling on Congress to approve additional aid to Ukraine in its war against Russia's invasion. More broadly, Biden said that freedom and democracy are under attack both at home and overseas at the very same time. Today, Russia really challenges the stability in the post-Soviet region by its geopolitical movements to fight the spread of democracy. And we can see the current destabilization in Eastern Europe as well as in the South Caucasus due to Russia's policies. As a counteraction to Russia's foreign policy, we have to state the NATO enlargement, which is done to prevent or to resist to Russia's new invasion provisions to other Eastern European democratic states. As for other autocratic post-Soviet states such as Belarus and Azerbaijan, we can see a similar situation when the opposition leaders are arrested, captured, or exiled, sometimes killed. In this regard, Azerbaijani leader imitates the Russia's leader's behavior. The last presidential elections in Azerbaijan were not competitive and Aliyev received more than 92% of the votes. This victory with such percentage is proper to autocratic, more likely to totalitarian leaders. Russian political leadership is also very sensitive to the decision by European Union leaders on December 14, 2023, to open accession talks with Ukraine and Moldova and to grant Georgia candidate status. These actions are considered as a geopolitical decision. The whole EU enlargement process is now infused by it. Russian elites have been thinking in win-lose categories, in zones of influence and buffer zones, as well as about the weaponization of energy and strategic infrastructure for decades. For Moscow, threatening Ukraine in particular means a changing security situation for Georgia, Moldova, Baltic Sea states, and Armenia. At the same time, it is very important to highlight that if above-mentioned countries stayed authoritarian, they would not be threatened by Russia because in that case, Russia would not consider them as a geopolitical challenge. It is noticeable that Russia's policy is often not about dominating territories outright by way of military occupation, but through close informal links with authoritarian and corrupt elites. Gray zones with a certain level of disorder, weak non-democratic institutions, competing groups of warlords are a perfect environment for Russia to gain influence via informal ties, corruption, and military forces. This approach comes under pressure if there is a political change such as Georgia's Rose Revolution, Ukraine's Euromaidan, Armenia's Velvet Revolution, and the growing public pressure for democratic transition, EU integration, the fight against corruption, and less Russian influence. Russia's decision Russia's decision to launch a large-scale invasion of Ukraine is therefore an exception to the successful Russian policy of creating and maintaining gray zones. With the attempt to take Kiev by force, topple the Ukrainian government, and install a pro-Russian leadership, the Kremlin wanted to get the whole country under its control. It was not only a reaction to the assessment that with Ukraine, Russia is losing the key country in the post-Soviet region, but it was also carried out based on the assessment by Putin that after the limited reaction of the United Kingdom, United West, European countries, and the US to the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass, the Kremlin would not incur any major costs. The comprehensive Western sanctions and the support for Ukraine came as a surprise for the Kremlin in this case. Another attempt to clash the legitimate government in the case of its autocratic intentions is the case of Armenia when on September 1930, 2023, in parallel with the ethnic cleansing of Armenians as autochthon population of Nagorno-Karabakh, Russia's former president Dmitry Medvedev called on his Telegram channel for a COP in Yerevan. All these facts showcase that Russia does not support post-Soviet democracies and consider them as challenge and enemies. Post-Soviet democracies are threatened in an authoritarian neighborhood. To face this challenge, the displacement of global democratic norms by authoritarian powers and other anti-democratic actors must be reversed. But success will require a bold, sustained response that establishes support for democracy and countering authoritarianism at the heart of each democracy's foreign policy, national security strategy, and domestic reform agenda. Only in this case, post-Soviet democracies will be able to resist and overcome Russia's threats to their sovereignty and territorial integrity. The second part of my research concerns the fall or rise of Russia's geopolitical influence in post-Soviet space. After the collapse of Soviet Union, Russia was and is keeping its influence on post-Soviet space with the use of national or ethnic conflicts necessarily and mainly by igniting and freezing them. It means the conflict resolution in post-Soviet space is more likely the only way to weaken Russia's influence in this region. From the Kremlin's viewpoint, frozen conflicts keep its neighbors preoccupied and dependent on Russian peacekeeping services. According to the Kremlin, Russia is on roll for now. It might seem odd at this moment to discuss Russia's declining geopolitical power, but in the larger context, regardless of political vicissitudes and something approximating stalemate on the ground in Ukraine, Russia is losing influence and position. Even if it ultimately prevails in Ukraine in the sense of holding on to the territory it currently occupies, it will have done so at the expense of its global power. To use a chess analogy, Russia is attempting to protect a few pawns while putting its queen at risk. It is very important to state that day after day, Russia becomes more unable to provide authoritarian peace with its mediation or peacekeeping missions in case of frozen conflicts. For example, after 2020 war in Nagorno-Karabakh and 2021-23 Azerbaijan invasions into Armenia's sovereign territory, disillusioned about Russia's non-actions, Armenia withdrew from the Russian-led CSTO military alliance and invited US soldiers to participate in joint drills in the country. Armenia's geopolitical shifting to the West is due because of Russia's refusal to recognize the Azeri invasions and to assume its responsibility to protect the territorial integrity of Armenia. After the Azeri invasions, Russia and other CSTO member states didn't react and even didn't make a political declaration. regarding the violation of territorial integrity of their member state. After 2020 war in Nagorno-Karabakh, Russia still didn't deliver the defensive military equipment bought by Armenia, which also demonstrates that Russia is not interested in stabilization and peace in the South Caucasus region. It wants the conflict to persist because only in that case it can keep the possibility to continue its military presence as a fake peacekeeping mission. But even before the latest turn of events, Armenia was distancing itself from Russia. Armenian Prime Minister has declared last summer that Armenia is not Russia's ally in the war with Ukraine. The Kremlin, meanwhile, saw less value in assisting a wavering ally. This downward spiral of waning Russian interest and wavering Russia's ally is visible elsewhere in the former Soviet space. Back in January 2022, before it invaded Ukraine proper, Russia helped the Kazakh government suppress an outbreak of protests. But 6 months later, Kazakhstan was also distancing itself from the Kremlin as it began to reach out to the West and welcome Russian fleeing forced mobilization. When clashes erupted between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, two close allies of the Kremlin, Russia didn't step in to mediate the conflict. As for Georgia, Russia's ties with this country more likely have improved despite the war in 2008, which has ended with Moscow's de facto control of the Georgian territories in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. But nowadays situation is related to the fear of Georgia to be invaded again by Russia. There is no doubt that Georgia may not be returned to the Russian path because of its strong civil society and also considering that on November 8, 2023, the European Commission issued an official recommendation to grant candidate status to Georgia, which was confirmed on 14 December 2023. Georgia is still a key country in the South Caucasus and post-Soviet region, crucial in terms of transit and trade, but also as an example of reforms and transatlantic integration. Here again, Russia is in competition with the EU over geopolitical influence in this key region, but also as a norm setter in regional conflicts or a legal sphere. The attempt of the Georgian government to introduce a foreign agent law in spring 2023, copied from Russian legislation and aimed at cutting civil society off from the external funding, was stopped by public protests at the last moment. The Russian leadership is willing to use force against neighboring countries if they want to be democratic and furthermore leave Moscow's sphere of influence. In the understanding of Russian elites, post-Soviet countries are not sovereign and their attempt to integrate with other institutions, especially with Western ones such as NATO or EU, needs to be sanctioned if Russia is not to lose its position as the regional hegemon in post-Soviet space. For the Belarus, the bond with Russia remains tight, with the latter even proposing a three-way cooperation with North Korea. However, prior to invasion of Ukraine, Russia had much greater influence in its near abroad, from the Caucasus to the Central Asia. Putin thought that he could kill the chicken to scare the monkey by invading Ukraine and putting the fear of intervention into all other neighboring countries. Instead, with the exception of Belarus, other former Soviet republics can easily see that Russia not only has failed to kill the chicken, but it has sustained some significant scratches in return. Worse, from the Kremlin perspective, Russia might have lost even more influence farther from home. In its war with the democratic trends, Russia strengthens ties with other authoritarian leaders to supply weapons for its invasion to Ukraine. But the consolidation of this authoritarian axis comes as Russia's influence has declined among more powerful countries. For example, Saudi Arabia pointedly didn't invite Russia to a meeting organized with Ukraine on finding solutions to the conflict. India's Prime Minister Modi openly reproached Putin about the war, and Russian-Indian relations have eroded over the last year. India is developing its ties with Western countries as an alternative in its economic competition with China. Last mutual visits in Paris and New Delhi aim to economic and even strategic partnership with France, as well as military supplies to Armenia, the jury Russia's ally, showcases that not only big players, but also smaller ones, mainly in post-Soviet space, are diversifying their policies, which will lead to the geopolitical decline of Russia. Even some African leaders have been similarly angry over rising food and energy prices as a result of Russia's actions in Ukraine. The deaths of Yevgeny Prigozhin and the breakout of the Wagner Group are also endangering the more informal ties that Russia has forged with several African countries. Economic sanctions have blunted Russia's participation in the global economy. The invasion of Ukraine nipped in the bud Putin's modest effort to reduce Russia's carbon footprint and play some kind of role in climate negotiations. Russia withdrew from the International Criminal Court in 2016 after the ICC criticized the annexation of Crimea, and Putin himself must now be careful when he travels abroad because of the outstanding ICC warrant for his arrest on charges of war crimes. Russia's ally Armenia has recently approved and ratified the Rome Statute, which means that Russian leader can't risk visiting Yerevan too. The political, economic, and energetic isolation of Russia will undoubtedly lead to its geopolitical decline and to the remaking of existing world order. Instead of being more like China, a powerful global actor despite some conflict with the United States and Europe, Russia becomes increasingly more like North Korea, an isolated, inward-looking nuclear power with declining influence beyond its borders. The war against Ukraine is not only changing Russia, however, but also its relations with its post-Soviet neighbors. Russian interests have changed within the new context of comprehensive Western sanctions and an economic and political decoupling from the West. Russia has to concentrate its resources on Ukraine. It is becoming weaker as an authoritarian security provider more and more. Since trade and transit routes to Europe are now disrupted, investments in infrastructure and new corridors, as well as cooperation to circumvent sanctions, are growing. Now let's highlight the main research conclusions. The struggle between autocratic and democratic trends in former Soviet space showcases the major trend of upcoming years that will affect the new order in post-Soviet space. In this situation, former Soviet republics with a democratic vision really suffer because of Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine, and also Russia can no more strengthen its hegemony over post-Soviet region. It will have to compete with other global and regional actors for influence such as United States, European Union, China, India, Turkey, and Iran. With its war against democracy in post-Soviet space, and with its invasion of Georgia and Ukraine, as well as de facto non-recognition of Armenia's borders with Azerbaijan, the several threats over Moldova, Russia has opened a Pandora's box and launched the process of destabilization in post-Soviet space. At the same time, Russia still has a lot of instruments to influence the post-Soviet space, be it in terms of energy dependency, like in the case of Moldova and Armenia, labor migration, like in the case of several Central Asian countries, or as a market, especially within the framework of the Eurasian Economic Union. They are helping to keep the Russian economy running at the time of war and partial mobilization. Russia has been able to set the framework within which the West, particularly the EU and the post-Soviet democratic states, are now forced to act. At the same time, it has to be argued that Russia itself has launched the irreversible process of geopolitical retreat despite the efforts to keep the hegemony in post-Soviet space. To reverse the decline of democratic trends, democratic governments need to strengthen domestic laws and institutions while taking bold, coordinated actions to support the struggle for democracy around the world. In less free countries, Democrats must unite to resist the encroachment of unchecked power and work toward expanding freedom for all individuals. Only global solidarity among democracy's defenders can successfully counter the combined aggression of its adversaries. The democratization will give an opportunity for diversification and will decrease the dependence of democratic rulers from autocratic ones. Consequently, Russia is very sensitive to the circumstance because it will lead to the fall of its geopolitical influence. Otherwise, by destroying democratic trends in post-Soviet region, Russia will keep and even increase its geopolitical influence in this space. Thank you for your attention.